screen. And we will get started. So I have Rachel here with me today, and we'll both introduce ourselves. But today, obviously, we're going to be talking about acing the virtual interview, and this is a part of our hashtag Get Hired 2021 series. So this is just one presentation out of several that we're doing. So I highly encourage you, if you enjoyed the presentation today, to think about attending some of our other ones as well. Okay, so to get started, I wanted to start with a couple introductions. So my name is Katie Eisenhower. I recognize some of your names on here. I am one of the career coaches, and I work a lot with students in the College of Arts and Sciences. And one little tidbit I wanted to share from my interviewing experience as we get started, one piece of advice I've learned is that if you have issues with internet connectivity at all, it's best to fake it till you make it, if you've ever heard of that. So when I was interviewing for this job, I actually had some internet issues. And my colleagues now tell me that I seemed really calm and composed when I came back and just kept on going, when really on the inside I was completely freaking out. So fake it till you make it is a great way if you're feeling a little doubtful, if you're having internet issues, stay calm. Things will work out. So, Rachel, if you want to introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for joining us on your academic holiday. We know the weather outside, at least here in Cincinnati, is beautiful. So hopefully you were outside before this, or you'll be able to get outside after this and soak up some of the sunshine that's trying to peek through those clouds out there. So I am also a career coach here in the Career Development Office, and I work primarily with students in the College of Business. So if you're a business major, I am your designated career coach. I also work with sport management and sport marketing majors, and then all of the economics majors, even if they're not in the College of Business. So if you're any of those majors, I'm your career coach. And then an interviewing tip that I have, or an experience that I had with interviewing, was knowing when to stop. So you get asked a question, they want to know about, your experience, and in your head, you're like, oh, I could talk about this, I could talk about that, I could talk about that. Oh, I have all these examples I could talk about. And so one of the things that I learned is I was like, okay, I'm going to give one example, and that's going to be it. I'm not going to give them every single example that I can think of, because they have other questions that they want to ask me. So I need to practice being concise and making sure that I don't bore them with all of my experiences. So that was the thing that I learned kind of also when I was interviewing for this job. It was like the filter, and I was like, my gut's saying I should not give another example, so I'm going to not do that.
Perfect. Oh, that's a great one. Okay, so before we jump into the content, really quickly, I just wanted to remind you all that we don't just help with interviewing in our office. We help with really any career step that you're having, or any career goal in your journey. So that includes exploring majors, exploring careers for your major. That includes other parts of preparing for jobs, such as job search strategies, making sure you have a good resume and cover letter. That includes attending career events, so attending smaller part-time job fairs that we have, volunteer fairs, and of course that includes preparing for life after Xavier. So if you're planning to go to graduate school, if you're evaluating job offers in the future. So while we do a lot with interviewing, I wanted to remind you that really any part of your career journey we're here to help with. So with that being said, we're going to start with a little fun activity. I'm curious for all of you, and feel free to just drop a word in the chat. When you think about having to interview for a job, an internship, or graduate school, how does that make you feel? So feel free to put just a word or a phrase in the chat. I'm curious how all of you feel about interviewing.
I hope it's okay that I participate.
Oh, for sure. Terrified, nervous, underprepared, nervous, very nervous. Yeah, so you can see there's definitely some common themes. I think the biggest thing is that you all are time management called into question. Yes. So feeling nervous is definitely a very normal feeling to have for interviews. And I want to hopefully reassure all of you today that while it's completely normal, you wouldn't be human, I don't think, if you didn't get nervous for an interview, especially for a job or a position that you're really excited about. But hopefully our presentation today will alleviate some of those nerves by making you feel more prepared as you go out for whatever you're interviewing for in the future. So thanks for the participation. Yes, there's going to be a lot of opportunities to engage throughout the presentation. So definitely appreciate that. Okay, so today, just a little bit of a roadmap of where we'll be going today. We're going to talk about how to effectively prepare for an interview, the day of the interview, identifying tips for really mastering that day, that interview. We're going to talk briefly about how to respond to popular interview questions, and then really discuss developing a follow-up strategy. And while this presentation really covers interviews in general, we are focusing on virtual interviews, especially because they are so common right now with COVID. So you'll see at the top, there's going to be several virtual quick tips throughout the presentation. So pay attention to those as well as we get started. So let's begin.
All right, so another opportunity for you to share with us in the chat how you're feeling, but we want to know what you think one of the most common mistakes you can make in an interview is. So go ahead and drop in the chat, what do you think is one of the most common mistakes you can make in an interview? Repeating yourself, it's a good one. Any other thoughts? There are no wrong answers. Not knowing about the business, that is great. And that's really kind of what we're looking for here. So one of the biggest mistakes that employers share with us in terms of things that they're seeing that students and alumni don't do before they go into the interview is not do their research on the role, the company, the industry, and not really know that much about the organization. Knowing things like common acronyms, right? If the business name is an acronym, you should maybe think about what does that acronym stand for? So some of those things that are really important to think about is making sure that you're preparing. And even by showing up today to the session on your one day off in March, you're going to help yourself prepare for interviews that you're going to go into. So we're going to talk about some areas that you can work in to prepare and make sure that you don't face that common mistake that employers share with us. So we're going to talk on 6 different areas. I'm going to take you through some, Katie's going to take you through some, and then we'll kind of keep moving into our presentation. So the 6 that we're going to focus on today, oh, I was going to read, sorry. So the 6 that we're going to focus on today, we're going to talk about researching the role in the organization. So that's one of those pieces that Maggie mentioned in the chat, really good thing to make sure that you spend some time with. We're going to talk about how to anticipate questions and brainstorm experiences. So one of the things that folks said that they were worried about or they think about with interviews, they said they felt nervous. And one of the ways that you can help prepare yourself and help counteract some of those feelings of nervousness is trying to guess what questions you think they might ask and what experiences can you use to talk about to answer those questions. Dressing for success, of course, professional attire, making that positive first impression is always a piece of something that matters in interviews, so we want to make sure that we're prepared for that. We're going to also talk about logistics, so how do we plan, again, kind of calming those nerves, making sure that we're as ready as we can be before we get started. Planning what you're going to bring to wherever it is that you do your interview. We do actually have interview spaces available in the studio, so if you needed to book a quiet place away from your roommates who wanted to play heavy metal or your cat who won't leave you alone, we have spaces available for that. And then last but not least, some things to keep in mind with virtual interviews because they are so different than in-person interviews. All right, so when we think about researching the role and organization, there are a variety of different tools that you can use to help you find information about who the organization is, what they value, and how might you go about finding that information. So I would say use your online tools, right? So once you find the job description and you find a job that you want to apply for, it's a good idea to print it off, make sure you have it on hand and you can refer to it later. But use things like Handshake, LinkedIn, the company's websites, the company's social media pages. You can also use the LinkedIn alumni tool, which if you're not familiar with LinkedIn, we're actually going to do a session on LinkedIn later this month. I'll make sure that that link gets in the chat later. But a really good resource is find out if there are any alums who work at that company who you can maybe get connected with and do an informational interview with there too. So here you can see kind of an example of Kroger's values. So just a screenshot from their website of some of the things that they value. And you might think about trying to work those in an interview as well as in your application materials too. So even before you're doing the interview. You also want to make sure, and so I talked about, printing out the job description. That's a really good way to help you understand the role. So when you're trying to figure out what skills and experiences are they going to want me to have, and making sure you're really familiar with the job description, because the last thing you want them to do is get in there and be like, oh no, this is not the job I thought it was, right? So if you print the job description, you have it in front of you, you're going to have a really good understanding of what they're going to look for you to do, what experiences they're going to want you to have, and you can take that with you into the interview. All right, go ahead and go to the next one. Great, thank you. So that printed job description that's helpful in understanding the role is also your best friend in anticipating questions and brainstorming your experiences. So you want to go ahead and look at those required skills and experiences and figure out, okay, based on those things, what do I have? What can I talk about that I can offer? And what questions might they be asking, right? So they're writing this job description based on the things that you're going to be asked to do, right? So they've got, okay, this is the jobs that they're going to have, so this is what we need them to be able to do. And so you can say, okay, this is what they need me to be able to do, and this is how I can prove that I can do those things, right? So it's all connected, and they're going to use that job description when they come up with questions to ask you. So if you look at the required skills and experiences for this position, let's take a moment in the chat. Can you give me a guess on a question that you might be asked looking at this kind of sample job description? Again, there are no wrong answers, so feel free to drop something in the chat. All right, Katie says her ability to multitask. Any other guesses? So I'm seeing things about developing relationships, right? So they might talk about my experience working with peers, right, in group projects. They could ask about your experience working with people on different levels. So if you ever had to supervise someone or manage someone, but it also could be something like, working with professors, right, or staff on campus, things like that, in a student organization, something like that. I'm seeing an innovative approach, right? So they could ask you about a time that you had to develop a process or you created it, had a new idea and how you got people to buy into it, things like that. They're looking for Word, Excel, PowerPoint skills. So there might be some questions about digital technology or about your presentation skills, right? So kind of a variety of different things that we're seeing kind of directly related to what's written in this sample job description. So clearly, they're valuing good teamwork. Probably going to ask you some questions about that. Any ideas of examples that you could use to talk about your experiences to kind of answer some of those questions?
I'll jump in for this one. I was going to say, Rachel mentioned this already, but I think sometimes, using classroom examples. So Rachel talked about how teamwork might be a skill that they'll ask about. Oh, let me brainstorm a group project that I did recently that shows what role I typically take on a team. Or, okay, they might ask me about an innovative idea I had or a new idea I had. Maybe in my part-time job, I came up with a faster way to do something, or maybe in an internship, I planned a new event that hadn't been done before. So thinking through like, okay, what types of experiences have I had? What types of things or skills have I developed in those experiences that I can talk about based on this job description and the questions that they might ask me.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. Anything's fair game. Don't feel like it has to be a work experience when you're talking about, you're giving an interview answer. All right, I'm ready for the next one. Perfect. All right. So last but not least, we do have to talk about dressing for success. So when we think about dressing for success, I think that's something that people always think about when they're thinking about in-person interviews. But, in a virtual interview where you can see maybe my collarbones and up, you can't really see that much of me. I know that people are maybe a little bit more inclined to let that slip. But when you're applying for a job, when you're interviewing for a job, your goal is to make the best possible impression, and that includes putting the best foot forward with dressing for success. So when we think about things like this, dress one step up for the type of position you're applying for. So even if it is kind of a casual job, you know you're not going to need to dress all the way up. It's always a good idea to dress higher than you think you need to. My general rule, like my thought with professional dress, you never want them to remember anything about how you were dressed aside from, oh, Katie looked really sharp in that interview. Like that's really all you want them to say about what you had to wear. They don't want to say, oh, what was she wearing? Or why was she dressed like that? You just want to say, oh, wow, they looked really sharp. And if that's all your interviewers have to say about your clothing, because you want them to notice your qualifications. So you don't want clothing to be a distraction. So we have a couple of different examples of professional attire that you can see in these pictures. But generally you want to make sure that the focus is on you and what you have to say, not on what you're wearing. But think about, you know, in a virtual interviewing and setting, and you know yourself, right? But I have an earring here in my ear, and I notice sometimes when I'm talking to somebody, I'll be playing with it. I'm like, okay, I can't do that in an interview, right? But sometimes you'll wear your hair down, you notice you're going to play with it, right? So just be mindful of some of the things that you do. Stare at yourself on your camera sometime when you're on Zoom, and you'll realize all the things you do that might be distracting if you were in an interview setting. So make sure that, you know, if you are someone who plays with your hair, plays with your earrings, things like that, that you don't do those things during an interview, and you can wear your hair up, you could take out the earring, things like that. That said, you should also feel free to show your personality, right? So it doesn't mean like you have to be really, I don't know, I don't want you to not feel like yourself when you go into an interview, right? If blue's your favorite color, blue's my favorite color. It's also good Xavier color. So I like to wear blue when I go in for interviews or presentations, things like that. So you can add a little bit of personality through the color of your shirt or your tie or something like that. But ultimately, I would recommend you dress from head to toe, even if they're only ever going to see your collarbones and up. Various things happen. I've had to go get a computer charger. Thankfully, it was not while I was in an interview, but I've, you know, had to step away to go do something, or, you know, maintenance has shown up at my apartment, things like that. So if for some reason you had to stand up, you don't want them to see your hot pink pajama pants or your gym shorts or whatever. So just dress head to toe. It can't do you wrong. So just take a step, put on those work pants they haven't worn in a year, and get her done.
Okay, awesome. So next, the fourth tip is really thinking through the logistics of your interview. So some of this might seem more obvious, but it's great to think about these things as a way to prepare. So thinking through when is the interview. So I just actually talked to a student about this. I had asked, oh, do you know how long the interview is? And they weren't sure, the employer hadn't specified. And that's really helpful to know ahead of time. You want to know, is this going to be a 20-minute interview? Am I going to have to be sitting there for 45 minutes, so that you can make sure that you clear your schedule for that amount of time? It also helps you pace yourself in the interview too, to know, do I have more time to share this other example like Rachel was talking about before, or do I need to make sure that my answers are really concise? The second one is really just thinking about, who am I going to be interviewing with? Employers should typically tell you how many people are going to be interviewing you, whether it's just the recruiter, maybe it's a panel. Sometimes it's helpful if you know who those people are, or if they give you their names, to do a little bit of sleuthing on them beforehand to see, what is their role in the company? How can I make sure that I make my interview relevant for them? So it helps to see who's all going to be there for your interview. Next, what is the schedule for your interview? So this goes, a lot of times for first round interviews, it's just one, but if you have subsequent interviews, or you might have a final interview where you might be meeting with a few different people, so it's good to know the schedule, if there's just one or if there's multiple, who you're meeting with, those types of things. And then where is the interview? So virtually, it's important to remember that Zoom is not the only video platform. We use it all the time just because of being at Xavier, but there's several other ones like Microsoft Teams. I've heard of one called Blue Jeans before. There's a Cisco WebEx. So it's good to know what platform that you're using ahead of time so you can practice with it. And then if you are in person, obviously knowing where it is so that you can make sure you get there on time, you know what the parking situation is. And if you do happen to have an in-person interview, it's just helpful to know what the COVID considerations are, what protocol do they have, masks, what their protocol is, hand sanitize, making sure that they have things you need. Was there questions on that? I wanted to make sure in the chat. Okay.
No, it's just me putting links and saying that I had an interview over FaceTime once, so it could be anything.
Perfect. So once you know the logistics, planning what you're going to bring, and we put that in quotation marks because oftentimes if it's a virtual interview, you're not really bringing anything. It's just making sure that you have the right materials to make sure that you have an effective interview. So the first one, and Rachel talked a little bit about this, but the great thing about virtual interviews is you can have all these notes in front of you. So you can have the job description right next to you with highlights of skills that you want to talk about. You can have a little notepad, so if they write down something that you want to remember, you can keep that. So having those notes can be really helpful as long as you're not staring at your notes the whole time while you're interviewing. Make sure you still have that eye contact. The second is a water bottle. A water bottle is great just because if it's a long interview, inevitably your mouth is going to start to feel really dry when you're nervous, so just great to have water with you. The other great thing about water is it's a great way to stall if you get asked a hard question, and you can quick say, hold on a minute, take a drink from your water, and then answer. So it's a good trick if you need a little bit of extra time after a hard question. The dog raising its hand is just thinking about making sure you bring questions along with you that you're going to ask at the end of the interview. And then the clock is really just some way to keep track of time. For most of you, it might just be right on your computer. But for some of you, you might want to have your phone next to you. So you, again, know like, oh, I only have 10 minutes left and I still wanted to talk about this. How can I make sure to fit this in? Or they're leaving me 15 minutes to ask questions. I'll try to ask around 3. So it helps to have that source of time to keep track. And again, the great part about virtual interviews is you can have your notes right by you. So if you're somebody who I've recommended to several students to have some sort of post-it note with reminders like, you got this, or you're great, or hey, slow down. So if you know there's certain things that you do for your interviews, it can help with that as well. So then lastly, as we prepare for interviews, just there's special things to consider for virtual interviews that I wanted to quick touch on. First of all, there's different types of virtual interviews. Live is the type, obviously, where you're with the person live talking in real time, but there are AI interviews as well, where it's a computerized system that is interviewing you, and they give you a certain amount of time to answer the questions. So keeping that in mind, if you are called in for a virtual interview, that there might be different types that you could do. Internet connectivity, so it's a huge part of virtual interviews. It's so hard to think about how to have an effective interview if you don't have good internet. So trying to plan those things ahead of time, maybe trying to find rent out a room in a local library. Like Rachel said, you can request a room, and if you want to drop that link in too, that'd be awesome. You can rent a room or request a room in our office as well if you know I have bad internet at home. So that's something you can do as well. But the internet is a big thing because employers often do, even though they don't mean to, they often associate the quality of your internet with the quality of the candidate. So you want to try to avoid that as much as possible. Background, so just thinking about how the focus should really be on you. You want to try not to have anything super distracting behind you. You want to be the focus and the shining star. The importance of lighting, so really just making sure that your lighting, again, makes the focus be on you. A good rule of thumb for that is to sit in front of a source of light, and that can help. So for example, sitting in front of a window, maybe putting your desk up against a window, that can definitely help. Doing a trial run with the tech, so we talked a little bit about this, but just making sure you know the web platform that they're using or video platform, that you know how to use it, and if you're feeling nervous with it, going into the meeting ahead of time to make sure it's working okay. And then this may seem trivial, but we've run into these issues before, or I know people have. Making sure you charge your computer. It sometimes works best just to have it plugged in the whole time so you don't have to worry about it. And then turning off your notifications. So sometimes I'll get mail notifications and it makes that really annoying noise that haunts you sometimes at night, especially with all the emails that you get, students. So turning off the notifications, so that's another thing that you just don't have to worry about. Okay, so with that being said, we're going to move on now to the day of the interview.
Absolutely. So hopefully you're feeling like you know everything you need to know about preparing. And if not, That's okay. You can schedule an appointment with us and talk more about it. And we also offer mock interviews too. So I know that was another thing people were saying. I feel nervous when I think about interviews. The best way to help that is prepare. And you can do that with us. We'll sit down, we'll ask you sample questions, we'll give you feedback to make it better. You can do as many of those as you want. You could do 100. I mean, that's a lot, but if you wanted to, you could do it. All right, so some things to think about when we think about the day of the interview is the actual interaction, right? And we kind of split that into two different things. So we think about the audio and the video. And Katie was just sharing some strategies to make sure that you have, you know, kind of a good connection, that people can see your face, which is a super important thing. Every once in a while I get on a Zoom call and somebody's sitting with their back to a window and the sun's coming up. It's early in the morning. And I'm like, I can't see their face. I don't know if they agree with me. I don't know if they're following along. I can't see if they're nodding or shaking their head. I can't see anything, right? So those are some really good considerations. But we also want to think about, you know, how do we sound, things like that. With students feeling nervous for interviews, which super understandable, there's a tendency to speed up and talk really quickly, especially if you have a lot of things that you want to fit in and you want to talk about. So if you know you have that tendency, just try to practice and slow down. That's something else that we can help with in a mock interview. If you're like, oh, I'm really worried that I'm going to speak really quickly, we can help you with that. You also want to make sure that you're speaking clearly. You want to make sure that your microphone works. I know every once in a while mine will get warbled. I don't know why, but I restart my computer and it's fine. So if I have a really important presentation, I make sure to restart my computer before that so that I don't have to run into that issue when I'm in that setting, and then I'm going to feel even more stressed about it. You want to make sure that if you use fillers, you're aware of it, and that's something that, again, we can watch out for in a mock interview, especially if you tell us, you're like, oh, I know I say too much, or I say like too much. So try and keep those kind of front of mind and make sure that you're not using those. It's okay to take a break. It's okay to have a pause between your words. So we want to try and avoid those filler words. You also want to watch your tone. So this is something, you know, when you're excited, when you're passionate about something you're talking about, it's natural to get really excited and let that passion show, and that's okay. I'd rather you do that than sound really monotonous and bored the entire time, because that's not going to make the company feel like they're, you know, that you're really excited about them and you're excited about the position. So try and let that excitement show up and show that you're excited about the opportunity. Same kind of things with videos, right? So you want to watch your posture. They don't get to see that much of your body. So it's one of those things that when you're in person, they get to see your hand motions. And now I'm moving my hands and you like can maybe see my thumb, like when it comes up right around there, right? Like in the lower corner of my screen, but otherwise you can't really see my hand motions. So you want to be mindful of when you're sitting up straight, you know, so that they, you know, you're engaged and all of those good things, but you also want to be mindful of not, you know, doing like, whoa, like the YMCA in your interview, right? Okay, there's video evidence of me doing that now. Don't do that in an interview. You also want to watch for your facial expression. So again, I'm smiling, I'm excited, I'm happy to be talking to you all. So you want to be mindful of engaging your face and making some facial expressions. And then do practice that eye contact. And I say that because I'm staring at the pictures of everybody instead of staring at my computer where my camera is. It's a hard adjustment, but it's something that's really worth practicing, is making sure that you're looking at that camera, because that's what eye contact feels like to the other person. So really strange, kind of hard to do, not what I'm used to, because I want to see if people are engaged with me, but it is something that's important. And you don't have to stare at the camera. You can look at other people's faces because you want to see if they are engaged with you, but you do want to practice making that eye contact. And then, yeah, Katie's talked about the internet connectivity issues. So come reserve a space with us if you need it. All right, so we're now going to move into a little bit more of how do I actually answer interview questions in a way that's going to make me get the job. Okay, so when we think about what employers want to know, there are kind of some key categories of questions that they're asking. And that you'll kind of be able to correlate specific interview questions to some of these things. So they want to know, can you do the job? And what are your strengths, right? And why do they want to know this? They want to make sure that you're going to be able to be successful in the role. And not that they're not willing to coach you and help you be successful in the role, but they're also not wanting to have to like do everything for you to help you kind of get started, right? So don't feel like, you know, oh, I don't have any experience, I can't apply for anything. That's not what we want. And that's not what employers want either. But they want to understand that you have some skills and some growth potential that you're bringing to the role. They also want to make sure that you have room for growth in a position, and then you're not going to be bored and like oh no, why did I accept this internship? There's nothing for me to do. There's no growth area, right? So some things to think about there. They want to know will you love your job? And that has to do with your motivation. And that's one of those things. So when I'm smiling and I'm really excited and engaged, they want to see that in the interview. So they want to see that excitement, that eagerness, and that kind of ability to embrace challenges, right? In anybody's first work experience, I would expect that something will challenge you. And I would say if nothing challenges you, that makes me sad, because that's how we grow, right? So they want to know, how are you gonna do that? Are you gonna be resilient? Are you gonna be able to handle that challenge? And then they also want to know, can you work together? Are you going to be a good fit with the company in terms of what your ideas are, what your values are, what your mission is? Can you work towards the common goal? All right, so we're now going to take you through kind of big five interview questions, kind of deconstruct them and break them down for you into how to get through them.
Yeah, and these are, I think it's important to note too, that these aren't questions that you will be asked in every interview, but these 5 questions are very common questions that get asked in interviews, and so they're good to just have a good idea of how to respond to them effectively. So this is a really great foundation for you all to have as you move into the interview space, knowing these are big questions that often get asked in interviews, and knowing how to answer them will just make you feel more prepared too.
100%. So pretty much, I can say with confidence, every interview I've ever had has started with a variation of this question. Sometimes it's, tell me about yourself and why you're interested in this position. Tell me about your background. Tell me about why you're interested in this position. They want to know an introduction to you, right? So that's really what they're trying to get at with this question. So that they're going to ask you something like this. So there's no excuse to not prepare for this interview question. Why is this the first question? They're launching the interview, right? Typically, when people are doing interviews, they're doing some interviews back to back. And so they might have looked at your resume and cover letter a while ago, but they might not remember the specifics, or they might not remember, what made you stand out to them in that first process. So this is your chance to be like, oh yeah, this is who I am. And in their head, they'll be like, oh yeah, that's right. They had that really cool resume or that really cool internship or something like that. So when we think about how to answer this question, you want to give a brief overview of your journey. So I like to think about this kind of introduction where I'm going to talk about the past, the present, and the future. So I'm going to talk about what are some of my previous experiences that got me to where I currently am, and how do I see the position that I'm applying for fitting in with my future goals. So that's kind of what I like to think of it as. I do not want you to regurgitate your resume in this introduction. That is too much information. And remember, they've already seen your resume. They might not remember it, but they have it, and they could have it in front of them too. So pick out those high-level things, those things that they really need to know about you that you have to offer. So you might include things like relevant education, experience, skills, and this is really somewhere in the 1 to 2 minute range, probably around the 90-second range. So it's not going to be everything you've ever done, because that's going to be way too long, way too much detail. And the other way to think about this is this is your hook. So if you're a reader or you watch movies or shows, I'm sure maybe you're just too stubborn and you like to commit to everything and see it through no matter what. But I will sometimes watch the first couple minutes of a show, and if I don't like it, I'll move on. And imagine your interviewing committee is doing something similar, right? And they're not actually going to end the interview. Most of them are better people than that. But if you don't hook them, they might be more likely to say, oh yeah, what's on my phone? What's going on? What's my dog doing, right? So you want to make sure that you keep them engaged. And the best way to do that is get their attention early on and hold it. So really important to do that with your introduction. All right, and so another really common thing to get asked about is your strengths. And the reason that employers ask this question is because they want to understand what your strengths are and how those strengths will benefit their organization if they will. So when we think about this question, it's often going to sound something like, what do you think is one of your greatest strengths? And the good way to answer it is talk about those strengths and think about an example. So how do you know that that's your strength, right? It's not just like, oh, I'm a good leader. End of story. They move on to the next question. They need the evidence, right? They need to know, how do you know you're a good leader? How do you know that's one of your strengths? So illustrating that with an example is a really good idea. One of the things too, I will say with this, try and think about strengths that are additive to the job description. So when I think about, like Katie and I's job, we work with students a lot of the time. So if I said my strength was, oh, I'm really good at working with students, that might give somebody some pause, because they might say, well, 60% of your job is career coaching. I hope you're good at working with students, or that it just kind of is already assumed. But for me to say, oh, I'm an innovator. I really like to engage with the team and develop, efficient and engaging processes for our students. That's way more than just being liking to work with students and being a good career coach, right? So think about what's in the job description, and you can kind of work that into, you could say, in addition to what's in the job description, I do this, right? So trying to go outside of the basics of the job description, because those things are assumed, is something that I would really recommend doing this, because they're going to assume that you're good at something if it's 60% of your job description. I think this one is you.
Oh, yeah, I think you're right, actually. So on the other side of the strengths is your weaknesses. And I know this is a question when I talk with students that a lot of people are really nervous about, because they're like, how do I respond to this without making myself look bad? Or do I need to be honest about this? And really the purpose of the weakness question is not to nitpick or figure out, what are your weaknesses? Do we want that weakness or not? It's really to see, are you thoughtful? Are you able to reflect upon yourself and things you can improve upon? Are you aware of yourself? And they want to know that you're honest too, that you're able to recognize something that you do need some work on for the future. So the biggest thing for the weakness is to show that example and then think about how you're working to improve this weakness. So one way that they might ask this is, what is an area of growth for you? Or what is one of your biggest weaknesses? So I think as an example, because sometimes people are like, what examples do I even use? Think about things that are not, this goes along with what Rachel was saying, things that are not central to the job. So for example, if I was applying for the career coach position and I said, yeah, I think one of my biggest weaknesses is meeting new people or talking to new people. I really just have a hard time forming connections. They would be like, red flag, we are not hiring this person if they're not able to do that. That's a huge part of this job. So thinking about things that are not central to the job that you're going to be doing, but are things that you can recognize to improve upon. So for example, I might say, I think one of my biggest weaknesses is I have a hard time asking for help when I'm doing a new task. I get so focused on the task. I want to be able to do it myself. And so one of the ways I'm working to improve this weakness is when I know that I'm struggling with something, reaching out to my coworkers around me and starting to ask a lot of questions to get clarification. So that's how I'm working to improve that weakness. So that's just one example of one that you might show, and then show again how you're working to improve that weakness, because the employers want to know too that if you run into struggles, if you run into challenges, that you're willing to improve and think about how to do better the next time. So the fourth out of 5 is the why. So this is largely the point of your interview, and they'll get at this probably multiple times throughout the interview. But at some point, they're going to ask, why should we hire you? What do you believe makes you stand out as a candidate? Why should we hire you over somebody else who's applying for this position? So it's really good to think about this question ahead of time, because this is largely, again, the purpose of the interview. So when we think about how to answer this question, I think 2 components are really important. You want to think about the employer. So what is it that you bring that can benefit the employer? What is it that you really love about the employer? Maybe you say, one of the reasons I think, maybe you're applying, for example, for an environmentally focused company, and you've been really passionate about the environment for your whole life. So you say, I noticed that your company is really committed to improving the environment, and that's something that, really aligns with my goals and values. So that demonstrates, I know about this company, I've done my research, and this is important to me as well. And then on the flip side of that too, just thinking about, what it is in your values and your goals and your interests that you think is, again, marketable to the employer. So maybe you say, as Rachel mentioned before, I'm really innovative, and I think that's a skill that could really benefit this team, or something like that. So thinking about the employer, but also thinking about you is important for this question. Okay, so then the last one is behavioral-based questions, which is really almost a category of questions that employers ask in many, many interviews. So if you've ever been asked a question that starts with, tell me about a time when you, or describe a scenario in which you, ding, 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 you're being asked a behavioral-based question. And there's a great way to answer these questions to make sure that you are including all the information that you need, and that is that STAR method. Now, the reason that employers are asking more and more behavioral-based questions is because when you use an example of a situation that you encountered in the past, how you behaved in that situation in the past is a really good indicator of how you might behave for a similar situation in the future. So it's really helpful for employers to see, okay, based on how this person behaved in the past, we know that they'll probably behave like this in the future. So when you are asked a question that starts with those hooks that I mentioned in the beginning, you really want to use the STAR method to guide how you respond. So the STAR method stands for situation, task, action, and result. So to go through it really briefly, the situation, you're providing context to the example that you're using. You know, what was the team that you were on? What was your job? What was the internship? The task is what you were being asked to do, or the idea that you had, or the project that you were working on. The action will revolve more on what you actually did in that situation, how you handled the situation, those types of things. And then really the result is the outcome, or what you learned or gained from that experience. So I'm curious, and feel free to put this in the chat, and it's one quick word, so I know that you all can do it. What do you think is the most missed letter of the STAR method when students are answering questions? Feel free to put it in the chat, or if you want to shout it out too, either one works. Yep. Yep, you got it right on ahead. It is the result, yes, because typically it's really easy for us to tell a story that happened to us, but a lot of times we leave out the outcome, and that leaves the employers wondering, well, what grade? Did you get a good grade on it? Was your professor excited? You know, was your supervisor pleased with the results? So really important to really finish out that example strong with the outcome, but also think about, again, was there a skill that you developed from that experience that you can bring with you now to this position? Was there something that you learned that you want to do in the future? So thinking about those types of things for the STAR, specifically for that result portion, is really important. So to put that into practice, one example might be, tell me about a time when you worked with a team to reach a common goal. And I know it looks like we have a little bit of time to practice this one. I know it's a small group, so I won't do breakout sessions, but Rachel, do you have an example for this one, or I can do one too? I didn't want to like put you on the spot too much, but if I were to ask you this question, do you have an example you could share?
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to jump in and just say on the results thing, one tip I have, if an employer in an interview is like, oh, can you tell me how that turned out? That means you forgot the result. You didn't say it turned out. So if they say something like that, that means you forgot, and that's your red flag. Oh my gosh, I have to talk about the results for the rest of this time. Because they might ask you once, but if you forget more than once, they're going to feel like they're nagging you, and it's not going to feel like a good interview. But if you forget one once and they're like, how did that turn out? That you're like, oh no, I forgot. So then you can remember for the rest of the interview. So that's just a tip I have. But in terms of telling you about a time where I had to work with a team to reach a common goal, I'll go back to my undergrad days to make this a little bit more relevant. But when I was in college, I was an RA. And so I got to work with teams of 10 plus RAs to plan all hall events. And we were tasked with planning several all hall events each semester to provide an opportunity for residents in our residence halls to engage with one another and build some community. So one example was over interim of my junior year. I went to an undergrad where we had interim. So we had a month-long term over January. It was kind of different, but I wouldn't say that in an interview. I'm just telling you also, you know what interim means. But we were tasked with planning a casino night within our hall. And so we decided we had to go through the brainstorm process of what are we going to plan for events. So we had to have a brainstorming session where we came up with all kinds of different ideas. We had a lot of excitement and energy around the casino night idea, so we ended up deciding to pursue that. I took on a leadership role, so I delegated some responsibilities to other team members, including going to Target and Cub to which is a grocery store, to purchase supplies and materials for the event, setting up a committee for setting up and taking down the event, and then making sure that all of the staff was available to participate in the event. In the end, we had a really great attendance. It was our highest attended event of the interim term, and felt like students had a really good chance to engage after coming off of their winter break.
Awesome. Yeah, so perfect example. Yeah, so you can clearly see how Rachel set up the story, talked about how she was an RA, talked about the team that she worked with, the task of they were tasked with planning this event, the action, what role she took on the team. So you'll notice too the great, I want to point out too how I think it's easy in this example to focus just on the team and what you did as a team, but keeping in mind that the employer wants to know about you. Like, sure, they'll hear about the team, but they want to know about you as an individual. So you'll notice how Rachel talked about her specific role in the team and some of the responsibilities she had, showing her leadership skills or demonstrating those skills. And then you can see in the end what the result was, how it was the highest attended event. So really showing that it was a success. So that example provides a great framework for what those behavioral based responses should look like. So appreciate that. One other thing I wanted to note just for interviewing in general, if you're ever asked a question that you're like, this question feels like it came out of left field, I have no idea how to answer it. Just think about, okay, why is the employer asking this question? What do they really want to know from this question? So for example, this one about, tell me about a time when you worked with a team to reach a common goal. If I was thinking, why would an employer ask me this? Oh, they want to know what my teamwork skills are. They want to know how I work on a team. So anytime you're asked a question where you're like, what? Thinking about, okay, this is why they're asking me this, now let's make it. And then the other thing I wanted to say too is just making it relevant to the employer that you're chatting with. So making sure I'm not using a story where an employer's like, what does this story have to do with anything? They can clearly see, okay, this makes sense. These are the skills that this person was bringing. So another thing to keep in mind as well. But okay, now we'll move on to after the interview.
Perfect. Okay, so we talked about all the questions that you're going to get asked, but another thing that you may not know about interviews is that it is expected that you ask the employer questions during the interview too, and typically this is at the end. It's one of those things that if you're really long-winded, they might reduce the amount of time that you have for this, but typically they're going to give you somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes, depending on the length of the interview, to ask questions. It is a good idea to have several prepared. I recommend a minimum of 3. I will tell you, one time I had an interview, it was scheduled for 30 minutes. The person asked me 3 questions and I had 25 minutes to ask questions. So I was really glad that I had more than 3 questions prepared, because I actually did get the offer from her. I turned it down for a different one, but I needed to be prepared for that. And if I had only had 1 or 2 questions, I guarantee you that would have impacted how she felt about me. So, and it probably would have not led to my success with the position. So it's always a good idea to have more prepared than you think you need. Sometimes they'll get answered during the interview too. So when we think about questions to ask, there are 3 different kinds. So it could be informational, and this is going to help you understand more about the specific job, the company, the division, the industry, right? So this is a chance to try and clarify something maybe in the job description that you don't understand, or something that the company does that you want to know more about. But your purpose with those questions is to get information. You might also ask environmental questions. This is more about the company culture and the values. So if you're trying to understand, maybe work-life balance is really important to you, or maybe you're going to be taking a class over the summer, and so you want to do this internship, but you're also going to need some time for this class. You're just trying to understand some more about, is that going to be okay, or is that not going to work out? Things like that. And then there are also some logistical questions, and this is like, can you tell me a little bit more about the timeline, or when do you anticipate making a final hiring decision about this position? So those are the 3 categories. Any ideas or any sample questions that you can think of, and if you've already done interviews, what are some questions that you've asked at the end of an interview? If you want to drop those in the chat, we can take a look at those. Or we can move on because nobody wants to drop their questions in the chat. I am going to drop the career guide in the chat because it has sample questions that you can ask. It has questions you could be asked during an interview. It also has questions you could ask at the end of an interview. It also has a sample resume, cover letter template, everything you need to know. So if you're ever at a spot where you found a job and it's due in like an hour and you don't have time to meet with your career coach because we're not open at 11 o'clock at night, you can the career guide, and it's at least a good place to get started.
Yes, and it definitely goes more in depth about interviewing in general. So great resource to have on hand.
Yes, I have it bookmarked.
What was that?
I said I have it bookmarked.
Yes, no, me too. So to close or to finish off here, we're going to talk a little bit about following up. So when you think about the end of your interview, expressing your gratitude, your thanks for them taking the time to meet with you. I'll tell students that I meet with, if it's a job that you really want and you're really interested, feel free to convey that interest in the end of your interview when you're thanking them by saying something like, thanks so much again for your time. I just want to reiterate, I'm really excited about this job, and interviewing with you only made me more excited at the possibility of working for this company. That shows them I'm really genuinely interested in this job and I can't wait to hear back from you. Of course, asking your questions and then making sure that you have an idea of the timeline or next steps. Most of the time, employers should talk about this, but sometimes if they have a lot of interviews going on, they may forget. So just making sure to clarify that. And then in terms of following up, having some sort of thank you, ideally 24 to 48 hours after the interview. I would recommend using email because you know that they'll get it right away, whereas it's nice to write those personalized notes, and that's definitely something you can do, but keeping in mind they might not get it for a while, so supplementing with that email can really help as well. And then as you write a thank you, if you can, try to include some sort of personalized message in there as well. So if you bonded over how you drink a lot of coffee as small talk in the beginning of your interview, maybe saying like, it was fun to hear from you, glad you're a coffee drinker too, or something silly like that. It can help make it feel more personalized. Finding the person on LinkedIn is a good idea too if you want to connect with them there. And then just having your references ready. So for if they call and ask for them, knowing that you have that ready to send along. And then reflecting for the future. So thinking about, especially if you are on the job search, if you're a senior and you're on the job search, writing down questions that they asked immediately after your interview, sitting there and thinking about what questions did they ask me, I'm writing them down, because then you have a bank of questions to go from to practice with as you prepare for other interviews. So good to have that bank of questions. And then just reflecting and thinking about things like, okay, was there anything that I noticed that I could do better with in the future? Did I notice that I was saying like a lot? How can I avoid that in the future? So just thinking about how can I work to continue to improve myself in my interviews. And lastly, this is the most important thing. Please keep in mind, if you're ever feeling that doubt about, I don't know if they should have brought me in, I'm not qualified, a company would not bring you in for an interview if they didn't think that you could do the job. So they already know when you're coming in for the interview, this person could do the job. The interview is really figuring out those other things that we talked about previously. So you're awesome. Believe in yourself. Again, fake it till you make it. So even if you're feeling doubtful about yourself, still have that confidence, because if you believe in yourself, if you have that confident attitude, the more it'll feel like, okay, I got this. So keeping that in mind as well. So I definitely want to leave. We have a couple minutes for questions, but I wanted to end with this slide up here too. If after today you're wanting to practice your interviewing skills, you're wanting to schedule an appointment with us, you can scan the QR code below to get to our appointment webpage. And Rachel, I don't know if you want to mention some of our upcoming other events too.
Yeah, and if you want to go to the next slide, we actually have the peer career coach application. So our office is actually hiring right now. So if you are in need of work for the next academic year, we are hiring for our peer career coaches. If you're familiar with our office, these are the folks who are formerly known as our career ambassadors, but we decided to rebrand to kind of more accurately describe what they do. The application is through the One app, and it is due on Monday. So you have all weekend to get it done. And it's a paid position. You're going to get some internship experience. So you could be managing our social media accounts. You could be supporting our mentoring programs, our employer relations team, or our events and communication. So lots of different opportunities for you to develop some skills and put those interview skills to practice. So, and then I have put links to several of our upcoming events in the chat. So we have our diversity reception a week from yesterday. So it's going to be on Tuesday, at night. So you're here, so I'm assuming you're looking for jobs and internships. Diversity reception is going to be a great chance to network. Some of those companies were also at the career fair, so if you connected with them then, you can connect with them again. And employers tell us all the time that they hire who they see again and again and again. It's a really good chance to go, and no matter what your identities are, the event is for people who value diversity, equity, inclusion, and allyship. So no matter what your identities are, you are welcome to attend that event. It is for everyone. It is for anybody who shares those values. So if you don't value those things, I don't know. I feel like Xavier values those things. So I feel like you pick Xavier for a reason, so you probably have those values. So you are definitely encouraged to attend that event. We have our prep event for that tomorrow afternoon at 4 o'clock. So if you're like, I didn't go to the career fair, I don't know how the virtual fair platform works, we're going to help you learn that tomorrow at 4 o'clock. It'll be Katie and I again, dream team right here, presenting again on the diversity reception and how to navigate that platform. And then we also have sessions that I've dropped links for in the chat. We have a session on LinkedIn and a session on Handshake. Also later this month, there's also one on finding meaningful employment. So we're really trying to do everything that we can to help you all get connected to opportunities. So take advantage of these sessions. If they don't work for you, you can always schedule an appointment with your career coach, and we'll make sure you get the same information, because we all know it. It's just kind of fun to have a session and give you all the spiel all at one time. So yeah, questions with the couple minutes we have left.
Yes. Feel free if you want to just take yourself off mute or drop it in the chat, whichever works.
Yeah, and if you're like, I have no questions and I want to run away because it's so nice outside, feel free to do that too.
I think it'd be cool to